to the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. Here we discuss all matters paganism, heathenism, witchcraft, history, and mythology. Leave a like, leave something nice in the comments, share this with everyone, and enjoy yourselves on this amazing episode of the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. Welcome all back to the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. It is good to be back on this incredibly sunny, incredibly warm Friday afternoon. My guest for today is Frank Kenny. Thank you for joining us. Introduce yourself for the people who may not be familiar with your work just yet.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. My name, as you said, is Frank Kenny, and I've written a book, which is the first volume of a series of books I intend to write. It's called The God of War, and it basically traces the origin of the Jewish, Christian, and later Muslim religions, and how they've impacted the world that we live in today. The first volume deals with the Abraham right down to the Emperor Heraclius, which is in the 7th century, just before Islam comes on the scene.
Awesome.
So that's a summary.
So you have studied the Abrahamic religions fervently. I mean, I have said many times on the podcast and in private conversations that even though I'm not of Abrahamic faith myself, I mean, the hammer should say enough for that. Hi Tim. Sorry, my cat is always joining on the podcast. He always loves to be here. But I've always said that the Christianity, or however it got started, I'm guessing it didn't always used to be called Christianity, that what it is now and how it is practiced now is so incredibly different, and maybe even like a bastardized version. I mean, even being a pagan myself, I see it more as one of many mystery schools that have come out of that region. So could you tell us more about that?
Okay. I like your cat, by the way.
He's a goober, but I love him.
Okay, so, well, the book deals with the very origin of how the Abrahamic faith evolved. And you're right in saying that it evolved is the right word, because it changed. It changed so many times. Before Christianity came on the scene, it was already changing. I mean, Yahweh himself, if I can call him a he, was not a god. He was one of many gods. He was specifically God of War among the Midianites, and the Jews adopted them. They've changed the scripture to make it look as if he was the one God they adored or they worshipped for most of the time. But in fact, he was competing with other gods, and he was the God of War, which is why I call the book by that name. And he had, and this has kind of been edited out of the scriptures. He had a wife and he had kids, and the reason we know that is from inscriptions that have been found, and also some oblique references made in the words of the scriptures. But getting on to what you're talking about there, about Christianity and its evolution, also that is very interesting too. The word Christian wasn't used until quite some time after Jesus died, and it originated in Antioch. And there were, in the beginning, two versions. One version was version of the family, of Jesus and his immediate followers, who didn't see him as a god, they saw him as a prophet. And they didn't see his crucifixion as something that was planned and prophesied. They saw it as something that was unexpected. And they had to deal with that. St. Paul created a kind of different religion, and he had a different angle. And I go into that in the God of War, but I don't need to speak about it too much now. But it was already starting to change then at that point. His God, his Jesus, whom he never met, of course, was a God, Son of God. And that's the version of Jesus that is practiced by most Christians today. But it's different to his original followers.
Yeah, I know that even in Islam, in their holy book, that Jesus is mentioned as one of the prophets. So how did he go from, being a prophet, being one of many, I don't know, truth sayers, if you will, mystical teachers, to being the Son of God? Like that's quite the change. That's quite the upgrade, even if you.
Yeah, but strange enough, when the followers of, I just go back to the followers of Jesus because you mentioned Islam, they were actually banished into the desert, and they infiltrated what is now Saudi Arabia, and along with a lot of other Jews. So that idea of Jesus as a prophet, which is what Muslims believe, the seed for that idea was planted by them. The reason that the idea of Son of God is actually a Greek idea. Yeah, that if you read Greek mythology, there's sort of a combination between Greeks people, the people and the gods. This a different kind of relationship, and that was partly a Greek idea. Also, the fact that the Romans, the first Roman emperor, Augustus, was called the divine Augustus, and the Roman emperors were gods, and therefore the son of a Roman emperor would be the son of God. And so the idea of God being a man sort of came from there. So they're competing in an underhand way with the Roman emperors. So that's how that evolved.
Yeah, that would be a Greek idea. That very much makes sense, because a lot of the Greek gods, I mean, especially Zeus, of course, was known to let's say intermingle with human females, bearing what would probably be half gods, or them then being a son of God, son of a god.
And they're yeah. Sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, there are examples of gods, Greek gods, impregnating women as well. That they come on earth, impregnate a woman, and the son is sort of half divine. So yeah, that's also in Greek mythology.
Yeah, and I have like I said, even though it's not my belief, I do like to read about and research other beliefs and religions, just out of curiosity, more from a theosophical point of view. But I have noticed that a lot of what we recognize today as Christianity really came from the Greeks. Like even some people going as far as that the name Jesus and his image, like kind of being connected to Zeus, or the image what we would have of God nowadays. Just big white-haired bearded man up in the clouds. That's really a Greek or Roman Greco idea of what a god would look like. Is there anything left of the original image of Christ or of God, if you will, or is it all like Greek that we know now?
I think from a European perspective, yeah. In the early Christians, of course, were mostly they were in what is today Turkey and Northern Africa. And a lot of the early images of Jesus are actually people if they did make an image, they made an image of somebody that looked like people they were familiar with. So there are a lot of earlier images of Jesus showing him black or very dark skinned, and the apostles and so on, because the people drawing those images would have only known mostly people of that color and shape. So it's only later when he enters Europe, and the Christianity was slow to make an impact on Europe. The Europeans resisted it probably more than any other group. and it became very bloody. So the images that we have today of Jesus and God tend to be medieval. Like the recent controversy over the Last Supper, and you look at the people in Leonardo da Vinci's picture, they're very European, very Italian, and very much of a period. So, and that's what's come down to us. That's how we see, and of course, the Renaissance, Michelangelo's depiction of God, the famous depiction of God creating Adam, is obviously very much a European. But as I said, that came much later. The earlier images of Jesus are different.
Yeah, now that you mention it, and I'm kind of picturing it, they do all look very Mediterranean. Maybe like not brown or dark skinned, but like tan, as Spaniards or Greeks would be, like long, flowing hair. They definitely look European, which I very much doubt they were, coming from the Middle East. I can't imagine them being as light as they are, although you have certain groups, of course, like the Berbers in what is it, North Africa, Morocco, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe the Berbers.
Those are more exceptions than the rule. Like most are pretty dark skinned, pretty browned.
There would be. I mean, I think Jesus himself probably would have been certainly olive skinned, and not like the images that you have in your mind when you think of Jesus. He would have been a bit different to that. And his I think his ideas that have come to us were also very different. I don't think he himself was. I think he was very much an insular man. From this is now from, I gather, from the Ebionites, and the Ebionites are the name I give that is given to the people who originally followed him. Very insular, very Jewish, and very much we would call him in modern terms a nationalist. He didn't think of he didn't come to save mankind. That was St. Paul. He came to start a revolution or to encourage one, and that's why he was killed. That's why he was executed. He was executed for sedition. That's sometimes forgotten.
Yeah, because with Yahweh being a storm god or god of war, I imagine followers of him being very militant, not the pacifists as we see them today, who even though I do believe it has a different meaning, but like literally turning the other cheek, like not choosing violence, when there are so many examples of Christ being more of a warrior, more of a rebel, if you will, like quite literally whipping the merchants out of the temple. It's not something a pacifist would do. He would, if anything, try to talk them out of the temple, but not get physical.
Yeah, he was. There was the reason for that. The reason he did that was that when he went, he wasn't rich. He was poor. This is another thing. When you delve into the Gospels, there are so many of them. There's only 4 official ones, of course, and many of them written much later. But the earlier ones, his problem was he wasn't as well known in his time as he's depicted to be in the later Gospels. People wouldn't have known about him, but he would have been maybe a little well known in Galilee as a follower of John the Baptist, and he was poor. So when he came to the temple, he had to bring his Galilean currency with him, and he would have to buy the sacrifices with Judean currency, which the merchants controlled. So he would have to exchange his money, and he didn't like that, and the Galileans generally didn't like that, and that's what the dispute was about. So and of course, the merchants and the Sadducees, the high priests, were part of the Roman establishment, or they would have been like an occupying power or sympathetic to the occupying power. So yeah, he got really annoyed about that. That's why he fought with them.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. So how like with Yahweh, I know that he comes from a pantheon that he comes from a pagan belief, if you will, a polytheistic belief. How did that eventually like morph into monotheism? Like why did that change? I mean, polytheism, it worked so far. I know that before Islam came to in the Middle East, they were polytheistic people. I mean, like pretty much everyone around the world at one point has been polytheistic. So why Yahweh specifically? Why a war god?
That's a good question. I think the reason was, now again, this is something I also explore. The reason was that the Jews at some point decided that they wanted to be unique. And I think that happened after they came back from Babylon. It might have been developing before that, when they came back from their exile, and they wanted to say, okay, we're unique people, and anybody who isn't one of us, they've got to get out. And to do that, they needed to have a unique God. And they were coming, probably slowly evolving towards that before that. But that was one of the things that made they had to have a unique God to be a unique people. So we have one God, the God has chosen us. All the other gods are false. The gods that other people worship. So it was a kind of it was almost racial. It was setting themselves up as something unique, and I think that's how it evolved. They then rewrote it. The God that came to Abraham was their God. They may have invented Abraham, or he may have been part of some old myth before that, but then they have this continuity that didn't actually really exist, where there's just one God and one people, and I think that's how it goes.
They actually rewrote their story, rewrote their history to fit the current.
They did, but they did it several times. But the main part that they wrote was that they wrote a history of how they were enslaved. There's no archaeological records to support that, and that they invaded Canaan, the land of Canaan, which is now Israel. They invaded that land by force and wiped everybody out. That was the instructions they were given. We must kill everybody, wipe them all out, don't take any prisoners. And that's what they did, according to their history that they wrote at that time. But the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence shows that they migrated from east of the Jordan River, some of them, and some were already there. There was no enslavement, so it was one tribe trying to dominate the others. And they didn't fully succeed at any point, because there were still records of the other races of people, the Phoenicians and the Canaanites and the Philistines living there. So at no point did they actually wipe everybody out and take full control. There was always that margin. But they had to create the myth that they did. That would then justify them doing it in the future. And I'm talking about Middle Eastern history back then. I'm not talking about modern history, although mind you could make a connection too. But for the moment, I'll stick with the ancient history. And so it was necessary for them to have this to justify, this land was already given to us, it's ours, and this gives us the right to kick anybody out. And that's what they did. And they started throwing other people out, and they were pretty successful up to the time that the Greeks defeated them, and they became part of the Greek Seleucid Empire, and then later on the Roman Empire.
Do we know their actual history, or have those texts been lost? Because I'm quite curious to it, actually, because what you just said is what we are being taught in school, and you could indeed make a modern connection, but I do believe that is mostly because of those ancient texts. Our forefathers owned this land already, or this land was rightfully theirs already, so therefore we're taking it back. It's a very natural thing to do, I'd say. If it's the land of your forefathers and your enemies, or who you perceive as being a rival, is living there, of course you would want them out to reclaim your land. That it all makes sense. But do we know what actually happened, or do we know their actual history? Because from what I know, at least, is that they are mostly a people without land, without a homeland, that they are wanderers who don't really stay in one place. So having a homeland, that's quite the opposite of that.
Well, they were definitely there. But first of all, the records, very difficult to find any records. Most of the knowledge comes through archaeology and through checking bone fragments of people and looking at DNA and so on. So that's how scholars put together what the past was like, and all that archaeology and all the DNA shows that they were actually that the Jews were very closely related to the people who were already there. So they were kind of the same people. There must have been something that distinguished them, that maybe they were living in a different part, that they seemed to be living in the highlands. Apart from the ones who migrated from the east of the Jordan River, they seemed to be living in the highlands, and they were fighting against people who lived in the lowlands. There's also evidence that, you know, even though they abstained from pork, that in fact they were actually eating pork, and you know, so they were there, and there's an absence of records to support their version of history. So there's no records to support their version of history, and you'd imagine the Egyptians would have the records there, and the Egyptians, of course, have the writing. And there is no, whatever scriptures were altered and edited, we don't have the older version. We have some different versions from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but basically not so much, because of course papyrus and doesn't last that long. So when it's rewritten and edited, you don't know that. You have to do some research to find that out.
Yeah.
Of course, the fact that they were nomad people after that comes down to what happened to, you know, when they did rebel against the Roman Empire, and when they were destroyed, then they were kicked out, and they dispersed all over the world.
Yeah.
So that's when they became wanderers.
Oh, so that was after. Okay.
Yeah, and of course they were very good merchants. They networked very well, and that stood to them. That stood to the Jewish people down through the centuries. They were very good at communicating together. They controlled or had a big part in the trade in the Mediterranean, and they communicated very well, so even though they were scattered throughout the various regions of Europe and so on. But but they managed to keep their unique identity.
To this day, they are known as very good merchants. You know, without getting too much into that, you know, most of the larger names in the economic sphere, like bankers and all of that, they are mostly of Jewish heritage, and it's been well established, well known. And I think that's great, actually, that's like one part that of their identity that they could so rewritten history, rewritten stories. That's also a lot what happened with the Bible, right? Because you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are, I do believe, like the actual stories of what happened. And the Bible today, it has been written and rewritten and translated and retranslated so many times. I do wonder how many truth there still is in it, and especially, as you mentioned, the Middle Ages, how much politics, if you will, like literally middle-aged politics is written into our Bible, or there, how much of it is still true, like how much of it does compare to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of let's say the Old Testament, let's divide the two. The Old Testament would have been pretty well established by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, and so what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, there are various letters and books that are not pamphlets, I should call them, that are not in the Old Testament at all, and some of them are revisions of the Old Testament. As I said, the revisions kept going on. So there is some new information there, and there's some various editions of scriptures that were already written, but it's not official. But of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written before the New Testament. The New Testament, of course, is something different. You have all of the stories coming out, and then I think it was in the 4th century that some people, bishops at the council, decided, okay, well, now we've got to get rid of all these books and just decide which are the books that we're going to form part of the official New Testament. And of course, that's the 4 Gospels that people are familiar with, and the Acts of the Apostles and various writings of St. Paul. And there's a whole lot of other writings excluded for various reasons. And again, I should say it's political. The Gospel of John is the newest, or the latest, and the Book of Revelation. They were written much later after Jesus died, and they are the ones which give us the idea of the Trinity and reinforce the idea of Jesus being the Son of God and all of that. So you can say this is an arbitrary decision to decide, why do you put those particular 4 books and call them the gospel, and why do you exclude other ones? The reason is that at that particular time, various people had decided what the official Christian religion should look like. When Rome became officially Christian, there were something like 96 different versions of Christianity, different sects. And they had to sort of get together and say, well, we can't have that. And they were fighting with each other. In fact, very violently in some cases. So they had to have a council to agree on one version of Christianity. They never quite succeeded, but they managed to get rid of, because even up to the Reformation, there was different versions of Christianity, and after the Reformation, more. But they never quite agreed on one single version of Christianity. But they did manage to agree to a number of things, like the Trinity, like that Jesus was Son of God and that he existed from eternity, and the sins could be forgiven, and there was a hell in heaven and things like that. But not all Christians believed that, or even after that. And they had to forcefully make everybody believe that. That was violent.
I would say very much succeeded at that, because I know that like hell, as is mentioned in the Christian belief, it is not mentioned or specified in the Bible, correct? That there is such a place. I mean, I know that that Hades, for example, is mentioned, which we associate with the Greek underworld. Hell, in quite literally in name, is a Norse Germanic concept. Christianity, as we know it now, at least, or as was decided that it should look like at that council, it has so many pagan aspects. The Trinity is very much a pagan aspect. Like, look at any pagan or polytheistic belief, and you'll find some version of the Trinity, the underworld, hell. Like I said, it's a Norse Germanic concept. I mean, Catholicism, literally, which is, of course, Catholicism, Christianity, two different kinds of beliefs. But Catholicism literally adopted our gods and goddesses, changed their backstory, and now calls them prophets or saints. So I do wonder if it was like such a mystery school, why change it up so much that it's nothing like the original Christianity anymore, but it's basically paganism with a Christian layer over it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mentioned earlier that they had a big problem introducing Christianity into Europe, because there was no resistance to it there than anywhere else. A lot of the other parts of the world, I mean, I'm talking about what we now call the Middle East and North Africa world. A larger percentage of the population was Christian before Roman became Christian. And for the Christians, it was a matter of survival. In order to convert people, they actually had to adapt. So they had to incorporate pagan ideas or accept them. And so people have certain traditions. Let's say Easter. Easter is a pagan tradition, or Samhain, which is a Celtic tradition, which they now call All Saints, and of course Christmas itself, which was Saturnus, or depending on which part of the world, the solstice in Ireland. And so they started adopting those, and sometimes they had no choice. Sometimes you convert a pagan. Let's say, for example, you convert a pagan to Christianity, and the pagan says, "Okay, I believe in Jesus and all that sort of thing." But the pagan doesn't stop believing in what he already believed before. And you can read when you're kind of researching the book. There's so many letters written by local bishops and priests to the emperor, or to the Roman emperor. And the Roman emperors are Christian now at this point. Saying all these conversions, they're not real. People aren't really converting. They still believe the gods, the ancient gods. They still go to the local shrine or the local altar. They still practice the old customs. So Christianity was converting them, but it was also being sucked into the pagan beliefs. And that wasn't a smooth transition. Just to give you the order of things, when Rome first became Christian officially, the big battle was between what the Christians considered heretics. They're fighting Christians are fighting with each other, and they're actually killing each other. There's a civil war in North Africa between two different Christian sects. When they got sort of sorted with that, then they turned towards the pagans and started persecuting the pagans. So that was well into the sort of 4th century, or sort of beyond that, 5th, 6th, 7th. And this is an ongoing process where they're trying to attack pagans. They're attacking their shrines. and their altars and their images, but at the same time, it's going on for so long that they're also adopting them. Or the pagans are converting, but they're not really converting, and they're bringing their traditions with them. So you end up with a religion, as you said, that's part Christian and part pagan, and it's got all that added things in it that's what we've got today. We've got a religion that's got a whole lot of other influences, and of course this was happening even before but I'm just talking about after Jesus. Even before Jesus this was happening, but this is where we are.
Really, even before? Okay. I mean,
well, before in the sense that Yahweh was one of many gods, and they were getting influences from other religions like Zoroastrianism and Greek theology, Greek philosophy, and all that. It had penetrated the Old Testament, so that's there already. Then after Jesus, and you're trying to spread this religion to the rest of the world, it's adopting the customs and beliefs of the people it's trying to convert.
Is there even something as a pure Christianity, like as like without any outside interferences or outside influences? Like, is there even such a thing, or is it mixture of outside influences changing over time, changing with the people? Because it sounds like it has a lot of everything, but not one thing that you could like say that's Christianity. Like that in its core is Christianity, as you said, like Zoroastrianism, paganism, the polytheism of the very old Middle East. I just wonder how much purity is there left, or was there even such a thing?
I don't think at any point in my view that you can say any part of the scriptures is pure. Now, obviously, Jews and Christians would disagree with me strongly on this point. They would say everything comes from God, but I don't see that. The more I've done a lot of research in making this book, and everything in the Old Testament that I can see comes. You can trace it from somewhere else. You can say this idea comes. The Ten Commandments come from the Code of Hammurabi, for example. Everything comes from somewhere else. The Psalms come from much of Egyptian religion, and then the Celtic religions in the New Testament, not so much the New Testament, but the way religion is practiced today, you can see the influences of local European religions, or even most Middle Eastern religions, and how they've impacted what Christians believe today. So for me, there's at no point in this is there something that you can consider pure. One thing though that does differentiate the Abrahamic religion from every other belief and intolerance, and this is where you get the first commandment: first, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. And the second one, you can't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Mm-hmm. Now, that's what distinguishes the Abrahamic religions. They don't tolerate anything else. It's strange, when the Christians started practicing first, the word atheist was used. The Latin word means, was applied to the Christians. The Christians were atheists because they didn't believe in the Roman gods, or they wouldn't accept other gods. In the polytheist world, you have your own gods, but you also tolerate other people's gods. In the Christian world, you don't, and same in the Jewish world, and same in the Islamic world. You do not tolerate other gods or other beliefs. So that's one thing that makes it unique, that intolerance.
That's fascinating. Like just I know of that line, of course. It is also often used by pagans in arguments with Christians to say that, see, even your God acknowledges that there are other gods. He just doesn't want you believing in them, which is a discussion that will probably go on for eternity because no side will ever give in. Yeah. So that's the one thing. Okay. That's something to distinguish yourself from, like, tolerance. Yeah, let's just not do that. There is one God only. All the other gods, fuck them.
Yeah, that's sort of it.
That's brutal.
But that creates a problem within the religions themselves, then, because then if you say there's only one God and you can't tolerate anything else, then there's only one message and you can't tolerate anything else either. So and that's why then within the Abrahamic religions there is conflict. It's obviously inter-Christian and Jewish conflict and inter-Christian and Muslim conflict down through the centuries, as you know, and there have been wars fought with each other over that too. So it's not just tolerating outside religion, but internal as well.
Fascinating, because I have heard a lot that Jews and Christians, that they do not agree with each other. The beliefs are vastly different, even though they both have the same root, if you will. Same with Islam. Like we consider Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the three, well, let's say three major religions from the Middle East. We consider them to be Abrahamic religions, to come from like pretty much the same source, the same region. So why is it so vastly different, and why are they always at war with each other? And it's always a war of no, my God is the true God, no, my God is the true God. If they have the same root, isn't it all the same religion, basically? I mean, it's very heretical comment, of course, but no, shoot me in the comments.
Sometimes you get to fight over minor details and sometimes major details. But I think in the case of the Jewish Christian idea, I think Jesus himself, I think, would be horrified if he came back to earth and read the gospel, because the gospel is saying that he's the Son of God and therefore a man is God. I think he'd have been horrified by that idea, and that he would that would be blasphemy to him. And the idea that he would die for the sins sounds like human sacrifice. And I think he'd be horrified by that as well. So I think Jews found this abhorrent. Also, I mentioned earlier that Jesus was almost certainly executed for sedition. Mm-hmm. Crucifixion is the Roman punishment. If Jesus had blasphemed, the Jews would have stoned him. It was the Romans who were responsible. But in the Roman Empire, the early Christians, didn't want to be seen as revolutionaries, because there already had been a Jewish revolt and terrible consequences of the Jews. So the Christians couldn't blame the Romans for killing Jesus. They had to make a scapegoat of the Jews, which is what they did. So they blamed the Jews for killing Jesus. And of course, this is the old blood liability that the Jews have. The Jews have been persecuted throughout the centuries because of that. Mm-hmm. And there you have, Jews got blamed for something that the Romans did. And the Gospels are kind of rewritten, particularly the later Gospels, to make it look like they were shouting for Jesus' blood. Now, the high priests weren't happy with his behavior, but Jews in general didn't care. So, that's the source of the enmity between Jews and Christians, even though they believe in the same God. I think from the Muslim perspective, the problem with Christianity is the Trinity, and again, the idea of Jesus being a God. They can't accept that. So there's part of the basis of their objection to Christianity.
No, it's a funny thing to think about. Like, if Christ would indeed return, apparently is prophesied, I highly doubt he would like what he sees, with the church and the fighting between the religions and how the religion has evolved over time. I highly doubt that everyone who considers themselves to be a good Christian would actually be raptured. I think they would just be annihilated, more so, or Jesus would just go right back, like, oh no, I'm not dealing with this, like, you figure it out on your own.
Yeah,
this is not how I meant it to happen. You messed it up, go fix it.
Yeah, I think he would be, or even, I think that he'd be really puzzled about all this. He'd be wondering why he was regarded as a prophet, even, I think.
Yeah.
And I think if you read the Gospel of John, he wouldn't even recognize the people in it. Who were these guys?
Yeah, because that's another thing. Like, the Gospels were first written, what is it, like at least 80 years after?
But the first one was probably written 30 years afterwards. And it might have been based on something that was written before. But in the very first Gospel, the Mark's Gospel, it doesn't mention that Jesus even rose from the dead. That actually, there was a paragraph added at the end later on. And it's just basically the story of a holy man preaching. That's all it is. So yeah, and by the time you get to John's Gospel, that might have been 130 years later. That has, for example, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, which isn't recorded in the early Gospels. And that's an amazing thing to raise somebody from the dead. You'd imagine somebody early on would have mentioned that, but they didn't.
Yeah.
So Jesus, who's Lazarus? How did I raise him from the dead? That's where you get a small story that gets exaggerated with each telling until you have something completely different.
Yeah, like the game of telephone, something or someone says something and like at the end of the line it's something completely different because everyone
Yes.
hears something different. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
because that always like always had me questioning, like, if there is 30 years, that's still a long time. I mean, I'm 32 myself. That would be like me in 30 years writing down what happened now. That is assuming that I can still remember, or like not even my own story, but someone else's story, like 30 years later. A lot can happen in 30 years. A lot can happen within 1 year. Details get missed, stories get muddled, people get mistaken for each other. Why was there such a long period between his what is considered sacrifice, blood sacrifice, really? I mean, as you already mentioned, like, it's already called a sacrifice. So why was there 30 years between that? Like, why not start, I don't know, like writing a couple years after, like let everything cool down a bit, or flee to somewhere else and start writing? I mean, if he was such a influential figure, you would think you want his story out there as fast as possible.
Well, the reason for that is, first of all, he wasn't an influential figure. He wasn't that well known. But secondly, the small group of people, there may have been no more than 100 who were followers or knew about him, expected him to return, even though they didn't expect him to be executed. When he was executed, they thought he would return. And the reason they thought he would return is because the tomb was empty when Mary went to it was empty. And I explain in my book why I think the tomb was empty. They didn't say he rose from the dead; they just thought the tomb was empty. And then this myth of him rising from the dead came later. But the point is, to answer your question, they expected him to come back pretty quick. There was no need to write anything. He's gone and he's going to come back. And it was later, when he didn't come back, that other people started the need to write the story. Also, his followers would have been illiterate, and Jesus himself was probably illiterate, even though there are passages later saying he's talking to the scribes. They couldn't write, even if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
The people who wrote were Greek-speaking people. They were it's kind of a basic Greek language, kind of a street version of the Greek language.
Yeah,
they were the people who started writing. So there were people who didn't know him. They would be writing, like you said, 30 years later, writing second-hand information that they had heard a long time after the event. So that's when it starts. That's when the writing starts. As I said, it might have been based on something written a little earlier, but they had no reason to write immediately.
Because I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Like, if someone is going to come back, or in whatever form that may be, like just physically come back or rise from the dead or anything, then yeah, there is really no need to write down or to tell his story, because the story hasn't ended yet.
Yeah.
And if the story hasn't ended yet, there's no need to, let everyone know what happened. I understand. I get that. But the rising from the dead, like, that was specifically written in there to like legitimize the idea of him being the Son of God, or did that, like, what came first? Because rising from the dead, that's a scary idea, really. I mean, like, Hollywood has made countless zombie movies, and they all rose from the dead, and they're not, here to help us.
Yeah, yes. Well, I think, as I said, I think that involved. There's a number of explanations. First of all, for why the tomb was empty. It's very unlikely he was put in a tomb. But normally, after somebody was executed, they were just thrown in a ditch.
Yeah.
And the witnesses who saw him, who, by the way, as the story gets told, there are more and more witnesses. But originally, it was probably just Mary Magdalene and her friend. And they would have stepped a good bit away, because if they were seen close to Jesus by the Romans, they would be assumed to be part of some plot, and they might get arrested. So they would have stood a good bit away. And it was nighttime, and they were in a strange place. They couldn't anoint his body because it was the Sabbath. Sabbath the next day. They had to wait 2 days. So that's why they came back 3 days later. And he was gone. And there's no hint, as I said, in the original writing, that he had rose. That seems to have been a story that sort of people made up. Like, oh, by the way, he came back. We saw him. And strange enough, in those stories, they don't recognize him, which is kind of funny. And they don't. So how do they know it's him? But so then he comes back. But the message all the time is, I will come back in your lifetime. That in the lifetime of the people. Again, going back to why they didn't write anything down. They expected him back immediately. But it's a strange thing. There was a revolution imminent, and they expected him to come back. At the point when they're actually writing the Gospels, the rebellion has taken place and has been put down. So they're writing after that. And this is where they have predictions that Rome will be destroyed, or sorry, Jerusalem will be destroyed. Yeah, it's a strange story, the resurrection, but obviously it caught the imagination of people and they believed it.
I mean, it's a good story. I'll say that much. He rose from the dead, and in his ascended form also, I believe, because all of a sudden, like, there was a white light, or like he was dressed fully in white, which would mean that he is in his ascended form because he gave the ultimate sacrifice, or like was the ultimate sacrifice. It makes for a good story. It makes for a evidently
that comes even later, where you see that. I mean, in the earlier versions, I say first one he doesn't come back, and the later ones, at the later he does come back, but he looks like an ordinary man. And then later on, he is, as you described, he's in this heavenly vision.
Oh, that's even later. Oh, wow. Okay.
So you see a sequence of, when you read the Gospels, if you read them one after the other as they were written, you see the story getting bigger. It takes wings.
Okay. Man, like, so many of this is just unknown. Like, I mean, I have a very basic knowledge, of course, of Christianity. I do find it fascinating, all the stories, like there are so many exaggerations. Like, I never would have imagined that. And so he didn't come back at all. Then he did come back, but as an ordinary man, even though nobody recognized him, which has me questioning, like, if you don't recognize him, how do you know it's him who came back? Then he came back in his ascended form. It if you want to make someone the son of God, that's the right progression. Going from ordinary man to, like, now all of a sudden he is enlightened and ascended, and yeah, it would definitely give some legitimacy to it.
Yes, yeah. Interesting story. Well, it's lasted a long time.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's lasting to this day, and like I always, like, wonder that how many Christians, or how many people who call themselves Christian, actually know the stories, or like how many have even read the Bible, because it seems, especially nowadays, that people have that they have never even read the Bible, that they just go by what the pastor or the vicar says happened.
That is true, yeah, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I tried to give a progression of everything from Abraham, the original vision, right through to Jesus, and then through after that how Christianity starts to spread, and how it is, and hopefully people can get a picture of it and see how it's evolved to where we are today, and how it influences where we are today. But yes, I think that's the reason I wrote, because of what you're saying there.
Yeah. So like, we've mentioned Abraham a few times, Abrahamic religions. Was he the original Messiah, if you will? Is he the first one that God, or the new version of God, contacted? Because his name seems to come up a lot, and his story is incredibly interesting, again, with a lot of pagan aspects and a lot of things that I do question, like angelic visions, God asking him to, I believe that was Abraham, asking him to sacrifice his own son. That doesn't sound like something that a loving God would do. Definitely sounds like something a more malevolent war god would ask. So who is Abraham, and is he actually the one that we know from the stories, or are those stories incredibly muddled as well?
Well, the story, first of all, it's debatable whether anybody called Abraham actually existed. It's probably a myth, or maybe based on groups of people who migrated. He migrated from somewhere in Ur to Turkey, and from Turkey into Canaan. And that seems to follow a pattern of migrations of people at that particular time, around 1500 BC. So there may be some truth there about some migration. His God seems to was a person of the spirit that spoke to him. That now another person could say that's madness. You know, somebody thinks you hear voices in your head. That's what that is. And the voices told him to do things, and the voices told him that he would inherit Canaan, and him and his seed. And that story became very useful to the Jews, because they described themselves as his descendant. And by the way, so did the Arabs. They claimed they're descended from his other son Ishmael. So he's useful to them in that sense. Also, the interesting thing about God keeps making more and more demands on him, or the voice in his head, whatever way you want to call it. It ultimately asks him to kill his son to prove that he may, to prove that he's loyal, that he really loves God. And he goes all the way until he's stopped in the last moment. But there is some, again, you talk about the scriptures being rewritten. It's possible that in an earlier version, he actually did kill his son. And the reason I say that is that after this, he brings him up to the mountain to sacrifice him. He comes down on his own. There's no, always when somebody revises, they don't revise every part of it. And that raises questions. So there's a possibility that he may have actually, in the original story, killed his son. But yeah, it's not a very. I remember it having a big impact on me when I learned the Bible first when I was very young. But this is about as extreme as you can go. To be prepared to kill your son.
I mean, I imagine so. Like I'm a father myself, and if voices or a god or whatever type of being would ask that of me, man, that's the hardest thing I could ever imagine doing, let alone actually doing it. Like there has to be, and again, I don't mean to sound heretical, but there has to be something very wrong with him if he actually did that. I mean, like you said, he heard voices, he heard what may be interpreted as a personal spirit, although in my experience from from my tribe and my loved ones, especially my wife, seems to have a very deep connection with some gods and other entities like the Fae, for example. But they would never ask to like do those kind of gruesome things. I mean, are we, or are they worshiping a schizophrenic, or is that just a product of the time? Like I don't know. It sounds bad to me.
Yeah, it sounds like an immoral entity. If that is the God that all the religions are based on, it doesn't sound like a moral God, and there is no reason given for why this God chose Abraham. Wasn't by his behavior, wasn't a very moral person. For example, before he had his son by his wife, he had a son by his slave Hagar, and when the wife became pregnant, she said, "Okay, I don't need her anymore." So he threw her into the desert and abandoned her and her son, his son, in the desert to die. Now, they didn't die; they survived. But that doesn't strike you as being a very moral man.
No.
And then he went to Egypt and gave his wife to the Pharaoh in return for payment. Now, you can think about that for a moment. What is that? And he did the same later on in Gerar with another king, gave his wife to the king and he got paid for it. So this doesn't strike you as a very moral person, yet he is the father of the religion. He's following the guidance of this spirit in his head.
And if he is, then I mean they're following the wrong one. if that is the case. Like, he is not a good man to listen to. He's not a good man to follow. Like, of course I can't speak on how things went, 3,000-4,000 years ago. Maybe it was, considered normal, or more normal than we would consider it now. I mean, you have to be careful with projecting modern opinions into.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah,
of course.
I agree with you there. Yeah, I agree with you there. Although you have to also say that if there is people's views, and again, I get this very much when I do the research and read what people are writing in the past, that they have a very different moral.
Internet connection seems to be a little unstable. Hope that's not.
Would stand the test of time other than change. But in fact, it changes.
Sorry, my internet connection was a little unstable there, but yeah. So, like, very much a product of the time, and
Yeah.
Still, I wouldn't want to follow a god or someone who says that they speak for that god, or have heard that god speaking to them and asking all those things. I would want to stay far away from that individual. But hey, that's just me saying this in 2024. I have no idea how it was like back in 1000 something BC. But yeah, I mean, that's a good thing you have written a book about that, because there's so many misconceptions. There are so many things that we still have to learn about it, like properly learn about it. So where may our good listeners or good viewers, where may they find your book? Because it seems like a book that everyone who is even remotely interested in Christianity would do good of reading.
Well, it's called The God of War, and it's available in Amazon, and it's available in hard copy or in Kindle ebook form, or also in audiobook form, and it's also available in Goodreads. So they can, whatever format they like to buy it, and I hope they will. So yeah, it's available there,
Awesome.
Amazon and Goodreads.
Awesome. Now, I think I will. Yeah, I'll definitely get myself a copy, because I thought I had a basic understanding of Christianity. Turns out I know a lot less than I thought I did. So
we all keep learning.
So good thing good thing I had you on. Good thing you have written the book. I guess I should get myself a copy, learn a bit more, learn a bit better, try to understand it better. Is there anything else that you wanted to share? I mean, you've given me and definitely my audience a lot to think about and a lot to consider already.
Well, no, I think we've covered quite a lot. I hope they'd be interested in it, and in talking about the evolution of Christianity, and of course it's for the dark past, and of course it has been very good for some people as well. I don't want to just be negative about everything here. People put a lot of faith in it, and it's very important for a lot of people, for millions and billions of people. But yeah, I think we've covered most of the topics, and I've really enjoyed this discussion with you, and I hope your listeners enjoy it as well.
I'm sure they will, even though, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a topic that I cover frequently. I do feel it's a topic that should be covered, because nobody really knows what happened or how it happened. And I mean, I guess I know a little more now, even though I have more questions now than at the beginning. But I suppose that's what your book is for. So thank you very much for coming on. Thank you very much for enlightening me, enlightening my audience. This has been very interesting. This has been quite fascinating, and really has opened my eyes to a lot, and that I should research a lot more. So yeah, this has been another amazing episode on the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. If you liked what you hear, if you liked what you see, do give it a like, leave something nice in the comments, or cuss me out as the heretic I am. Share this with, well, everyone. I think this is definitely something that's information, knowledge that everyone can use. If you want to know more about the Greyhorn Pagans podcast, if you want to know more about the tribe of the Greyhorn Pagans or the Grove of Odin, make sure to go to our website, www.greyhornpagans.com. And if you're surfing the web already, get yourself a book from Frank Kenny on Amazon. It will be worth the read. So I thank you all, and until next time, everyone. Bye. This was yet another amazing episode of the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. We thank you all for watching. We thank you all for listening. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you will be notified whenever we upload something new. Support us on Patreon for early access and for everything else that we do with the tribe, for everything else that we do with the podcast. Find us on www.greyhornpagans.com. For now, we thank you